Hey everyone, today we're jumping right into a question I'm sure you've heard before. Maybe you've even asked it yourself. Is psychology a real science? Or is it all just, common sense dressed up in fancy terms? Let's find out.
You know the drill, right? You read about some fascinating psychological finding, and someone just shrugs and says, well, duh, anybody could have told you that. But is that really true? Or does psychology give us a rigorous, evidence-based way to understand our own minds that our gut feelings just can't touch? That's the real question we're digging into.
So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to be really clear on what we're comparing. Over here, you've got common sense. It's based on intuition, personal stories, and let's be honest, all our hidden biases. But over here, you have scientific inquiry. And that's all about evidence, objectivity, and a systematic process. To settle the debate, we need to stop going with our gut and start using a proper checklist.
And that brings us right to it, the official science checklist. See, any field that wants to wear the science badge has to play by some very specific rules. It's not about opinions, it's all about the method. And here they are, the 4 absolute pillars of science. First, objectivity. Your findings have to be based on facts, not feelings. Second, verifiability. This is huge. It means other people have to be able to replicate your experiment and get the same results. Third, predictability. Can your theory actually forecast what might happen in the future? And finally, control. Can you isolate the one thing you're studying? Any real science has to tick all these boxes. So, does psychology make the cut?
So, how does psychology really stack up against that list? Well, let's take a look at the methodical approach it uses, an approach that actually has some pretty deep historical roots.
Yeah, the starting gun for psychology as a true science was fired way back in 1879. That's the year a man named Wilhelm Wundt set up the world's very first experimental psychology lab over in Germany. This was the moment psychology officially got out of the philosopher's armchair and stepped into the laboratory.
And at its heart, it uses the same engine that drives all the other sciences. It starts with a question, a testable idea called a hypothesis. Then, psychologists collect real empirical data. They run controlled experiments, analyze the results for patterns, and only then do they draw conclusions. The whole process is designed to strip away bias and get to the facts.
But hey, talk is cheap, right? The real proof is in the results. So let's look at a few classic experiments that show this scientific method in action. And believe me, they gave us answers that common sense never could have predicted.
First up, the famous and pretty controversial Milgram obedience study. The question was profound. If an authority figure in a lab coat tells you to do something that violates your own conscience, what do you do? Common sense might say, no way, most people would just refuse. But Milgram decided to actually put it to the test.
And the results? They were absolutely stunning. In this controlled setting, a shocking number of everyday people followed orders to deliver what they thought were painful, even dangerous electric shocks to another person. This wasn't a guess or a hunch. It was quantifiable data that revealed an uncomfortable, powerful truth about human nature.
All right, Exhibit B. Let's turn to B.F. Skinner. He was asking a different but equally fundamental question. Can our behavior be scientifically shaped just by managing what happens right after we do something? This whole idea led to the theory of operant conditioning.
And this is where you really see psychology building its own scientific vocabulary. Skinner wasn't just observing things, he was defining and testing principles like reinforcement. Through countless experiments, he showed that if a behavior is followed by a rewarding consequence, a reinforcer, it measurably increases the odds that the behavior will be repeated. That is predictability in action. That's science.
And for our final exhibit, let's look at Albert Bandura and his Bobo doll experiment. The question here was all about learning. Specifically, do children have to be actively taught to be aggressive, or can they learn it just by watching somebody else? A pretty crucial question, especially in our world today.
And the results from his controlled experiment were just unmistakable. The kids who simply watched an adult behaving aggressively were dramatically more likely to copy that exact aggression. The data is just so clear and stark. It's not an opinion, it's a measured, observable, and verifiable result.
Now, these classic experiments are really just the tip of the iceberg. Applying this scientific method is what gives us the key to investigate pretty much every facet of what it means to be human.
And this approach has just blown the doors wide open to a whole universe of study. You have social psychologists scientifically figuring out why we conform, developmental psychologists tracking how a baby learns language from nothing,
Cognitive psychology maps the very mechanics of our memory, and clinical psychology develops evidence-based treatments for mental illness. Each field is tackling a huge piece of our lives, all using the same rigorous scientific method.
So, after looking at all the evidence, from its history to its methods to its modern-day applications, what's the final verdict here?
Well, the conclusion couldn't be clearer. Psychology's deep commitment to empirical data, to objectivity, and to practices backed by hard evidence firmly establishes it as a true scientific discipline. End of story.
So the next time you hear someone dismiss it as just common sense, you'll know the real story. Psychology is a science. It's an incredibly powerful, evidence-based toolkit that gives us the best means we have to systematically understand the most complex thing in the known universe, the human mind.
And that leaves us with one last question for you to think about. Now that you've seen the power of this scientific toolkit, what part of your own life, your own habits, your own decisions could science help you understand just a little bit better? Something to chew on. Thanks for exploring this with us.